Cardinal Turkson and Archbishop Vigano and brother bishops and dear friends, I thank you very much for your being here today and for your inviting me to be with you. The topic given me is Catholic social teaching and economic globalization. Let me begin by making the usual disclaimer, not only about my own knowledge of economic theory, which is thin, but also more importantly about the nature of Catholic social teaching, because that nature has implications for whatever contributions Catholic social teaching might make to a discussion of economic activity, whether globally or nationally. Catholic social teaching does not directly provide detailed models for the relationship between government intervention and private economic actors. It does not directly address technical questions about the workings of the market in any area. It does not provide a theory of scientific management of assets. So what does it do? It starts rather with an anthropology that is consistent with what God has revealed about human actors and their works, using philosophical arguments that are theoretically open to the whole breadth of human reason and therefore available even to non-believers. Its subject is not a particular community but the humanum as such. Its object is the establishment of right relationships in the biblical sense. That's what justice means in Scripture, not equality, for obviously there is no equality between God and ourselves, and yet there is a relationship of justice between us. It also considers interactions in political and economic activity because these are human activities, and therefore should be informed and free. Each of those disclaimers brings Catholic social teaching into some contrast, not only to the metrics and the approach of economic theory, but more fundamentally, politically, with the social contract theory that is at the basis of our society here and in much of the world now. So what I will speak about more is presuppositions that inform Catholic social teaching than conclusions, which can be argued in the ordinary sense of a presentation. And I'll have three sections, presuppositions, if you like, stepping back a bit to speak about the philosophical anthropological background, and then three principles taken from Catholic social teaching itself that complements much of what Cardinal Turkson said. And then thirdly, the last part, shortest part, will be the great challenge of Catholic social teaching in current times anyway to theories, both political and economic, that still govern the world, and that is the nature of a global regulatory authority. What I'd like to start with is a simple enough statement, isn't it, that what you see depends on where you stand. What you see depends on where you stand. I'd like to speak to two things that were mentioned yesterday, the IOR and a service economy based on higher skills. Because both of those phenomena, which are real, obviously, as institution or as development, are seen differently depending on where you stand. I was for 12 years in the general administration of my own international missionary order, which does work very closely to poor people around the world. That was perhaps the most formative element in my own understanding of the Church and its mission, and of the world itself, being very close to the very poorest people in many, many countries of the world. My own order does not run large institutions. They're very close to the ground in small numbers, but scattered throughout the world. In order to help that mission, we depended upon the IOR, the Istituto per le Opere della Religione. Why? The assets of the IOR as such directly are the assets, first of all, of international missionary congregations. If we want to get money into the Congo, especially that was true under Mobutu and even before, even when it was a colony of Belgium, because the colonial history is pretty horrific, particularly when it was the personal fief of the King of Belgium. The problem was to get money in such a way that the governing authority, whether the colonial authority in Brussels or the then so-called independent authority after 1960, to get assets in there without the government itself controlling them and taking them before you could get them to the people who needed them, the poor. And the IOR was set up precisely to permit that to happen, which I suppose when you look at the transactions could lead people who didn't know the context to think, well, this is money laundering, and in some ways, I suppose, in as much as it avoided the kind of reporting to governmental authorities that was absolutely necessary in order to help the missionaries and the poor people that they were helping, could be accomplished. So the IOR is a very important bank, if you like, or holding company for the international religious orders, because there are still places where the banking system is very undeveloped, perhaps less so now. But even if it's developed, it's very often corrupt in many countries, including at times our own. And therefore, how do you get a kind of an independent agency that also protects the sovereignty of the Holy Father himself, which is always something that is threatened by the Italian institutions that resent the existence of an independent bank, genuinely independent, on the soil of Italy, even though officially the Vatican city-state is independent. Nonetheless, the pressures are there, and not only from Italian banks, the Central Bank of Italy, but also from the European central banks and our own. So there's an involvement there that isn't always very evident of many actors, all of them concerned about the independence of this bank. And the bank itself is responsible for not being run as best, as well as it might be. That's all going to become clarified more and more as Moneyval gets involved. But the point is, the principle of having a bank attached to the Holy See that can take care of the charities of the Holy Father universally without being beholden to other actors, not all of whom are very friendly to the Holy See or to the Catholic faith. The principle of having a bank that the religious orders can depend upon in order to support their international works is extraordinarily important. It's very basic. And I suspect that as things move along, there will be more transparency. There is a problem of transparency. Not only that the Holy See doesn't want people to know the numbers, many people in the Holy See don't know the numbers themselves. They work in silos very often. Cardinal Turkson can talk to that. Archbishop Vigano can talk to that. One department doesn't know really the budget of another department, nor do all of them know all the budgets all put together. So there is a problem of transparency even within the governance of the Holy See itself. But the question there is simply organizational. How do you open up the numbers so that you can have a consolidated budget, which they don't have at this point? Anyway, I just mentioned that because where I saw the IOR at work as part of the government of my own religious order was very different from somebody coming in from the outside looking at it and saying, this, crazy bank, what's it doing? It's not working by normal rules. It wasn't designed to do that. And furthermore, we don't know what's going on, and we should. Why should you, and who are you? So I had a little conversation with Luigi last night, and he kind of... Secondly, when we look at the service economy based on higher skills, and what I really enjoy about these colloquia is the fact that we get metrics, and bishops aren't good at metrics. And so it's very good that we're being, informed in the way we are. I'm very grateful. But there too, in Chicago right now, we have a little squabble with the city government over taxing water. I keep saying water is a free gift from God. The lake was here before the city, and therefore we shouldn't have to pay for using what is a gift from God. That doesn't go very far as an argument in politics. But nonetheless, the point is that what's at stake here is not just taxation, nor is it just justifying a break in taxation because the church gives certain services. Those services could be given by the government. What's at stake here is community. When we have very poor parishes in the very poor parts of the city, and there are many of them, you can leave the splendor of the Gold Coast and of the Loop and start to see things that are quite daunting if you're going to live there. But the last institution, very often, in what is a food desert or a medical desert, food desert means that there are no grocery stores around. Food swamp means that you can get food, but only through fast food services. A medical desert means there is no longer any medical care in that neighborhood. The last institutions that are still there are often religious institutions. A storefront church, a Protestant church, a Catholic parish, perhaps a synagogue, now more and more probably a mosque. They're the last institutions there. And what do? Well, they do provide services. They provide spaces for kids to play basketball off the streets. They provide food pantries. They provide a lot of things that no one else is providing. In Chicago, 1 out of every 3 citizens of the city of Chicago is a client of Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Chicago. That says a lot about the generosity of Catholic Chicagoans. It says a lot about where the safety net isn't in terms of our civil government. So when you destroy that parish because they can't afford $30,000 or $40,000 a year to pay for their water, that's the salary of a priest, then you not only take away those services that are freely given, and that can, be metrically figured. We have figures equivalent. What would it cost the city to do those services? That's an argument that means something at times to the city government. But what you really do is destroy a community. There is no one then left in that neighborhood who will know when someone is sick and who will visit that person. There is no one who will know that this person needs to be taken to a hospital, even to an emergency room. There is no one who will know that person cannot go out on the streets, they're dangerous, and that they're hungry. It is a community, a set of relationships that is protected by that institution. And if you destroy it through taxing it, and you can do that through taxation, the communal nature of our civil society will be wounded, if not destroyed. And that argument is very hard to make when you're talking about how do we situate Chicago as a good actor in a global economy based upon higher skills and financial services. That's a good thing to do, and we have to do it if we're going to be a vibrant city in the future. But perhaps 20% of our population is able to work in that. The young 18, 22-year-old to 45-year-olds who have good degrees, who are highly skilled, quite intelligent, enjoy the arts, may or may not be married, but are probably sexually active in some fashion. And they come in, and they're able to create that framework for moving Chicago into being a global city in this kind of new economy based upon higher services and the skills that they necessitate. But about 80% of the city isn't there. Where the church is where the neighborhoods are, or what's left of them. The neighborhoods where there is the corner tavern and what used to be a movie theater that now may or may not be open, where there are the Knights of Columbus halls, where there are these synagogues and mosques and parishes. Those kind of neighborhoods that were the community that people lived in and that depended upon other communities, but nonetheless are the first place where they live and where they think. That kind of Chicago of the neighborhoods is still to be put together with the demands, the necessities of a Chicago that's going to be a global economic player in an economy based upon services that depend upon higher skills. And so the church some way has to mediate that. It's not to deny the necessity of our moving into a global economic order in order to keep the city vibrant. It is a necessity to say, how do you bring along these folks, many of whom can't develop those skills, in such a way that they participate, but in a very different fashion. That, of course, is something I have no answer for, but we're going to keep saying it because that's where we stand. What you see depends upon where you stand. And the government may see that, in this case they don't, or it may not. Whether it does or it doesn't, we still have to keep saying it, and that's part, I think, of what we bring to these discussions. Cardinal Turkson said it at the end, what we bring is the human person with all the relationships, because they're primary more than the individualism that we prize in our own culture. We're related before we're individual. You're somebody's son or daughter before you know who you are. So the relationships are primary, and that is what Catholic social teaching brings, the relationships. Start with that, and then work the rest out. What relationships are you sacrificing for the sake of productivity or for whatever else you're concerned about as you move into economic theory? That having been said, our problem now is to see globally. And where do you stand in order to see globally? So we'll talk a little bit about presuppositions and then move along into those three principles very sketchily outlined, and then the problem of global regulatory authority. Economic activity is human activity and is therefore open to moral or ethical as well as technical judgment. In other words, we're responsible before God and others for the economic and political structures that we create. In 1965, Pope Paul VI, in the midst of the Second Vatican Council, which was called to change the relationship between the church and the world, so the church would not be too defensive any longer, but rather open to dialogue with everyone, he came to the United Nations, the General Assembly, stood before it, and described himself as not as the successor of Peter or as the Bishop of Rome, but as an expert in humanity. He wasn't trying in a hubristic fashion, to say something about his office that wasn't recognizable for those who would pause for a moment to consider that the chair of Peter has witnessed and helped shape human events for 2,000 years and will continue to do so, Catholics believe, until Christ returns in glory to judge the living and the dead. It gives the Church a very, very long institutional memory. Obviously, the anthropology, the presuppositions from anthropological theory that underlies Catholic social teaching is not a materialist anthropology. There's more than matter. We are ourselves body and spirit, and therefore neither religion nor culture is simply an epiphenomenon of economics as it is treated in both capitalist and Marxist theory, and as many sociologists as well would lead us to believe. Economic man acts always in a properly human context, and that is the context that is presupposed by the theory and has to be made explicit. That's what philosophers usually do, don't they? Examine presuppositions to make what is implicit explicit so that then the theory can be more relevant to the facts, whether they're fully understood or not. So we should start with a few reflections on cultural globalization as the context for economic affairs today, because culture is broader than economic activity. It's second nature. We take it for granted. We inherit a language, which is the primary vehicle for culture, that none of us invented, and that's taken for granted in a way that becomes self-conscious only when you start to learn another language, and along with that, the gestures and the rest that goes with cultural relationships. Culture is the sum total, therefore, of our non-biological inheritance. And like material nature itself, we take it for granted until it goes wrong for some reason. We take our bodies for granted until we get sick. But if one is going to situate economy and economic transactions in a properly human context, some explicit attention must be paid to human culture, which is the context for shaping economic activity and therefore economic theory. Economic activity on the global or transnational scale is only part of a larger development in human communication and in the creation of a global community today. So we have to talk about globalization, I think, before we talk about economic globalization. I think, for myself at least, it's clear when I first began to think of the globe as a globe. I remember I was a graduate student in New Orleans at the time, and it was the Apollo 8 mission. And all of a sudden, on the picture of our magazine, on the cover of our magazines and in our newspapers, appeared that marvelous picture for the first time of the Earth taken from outer space. A beautiful piece of jade, blue and green, floating in an infinitely dark background. And for the first time, I said, oh, that's our planet. For the first time, therefore, we began to think relationally in terms of a whole. Young people now are very used to that. But I remember very clearly, it was a kind of a conversion of the imagination at that time, and therefore with that also a conversion in the way we think, to see that we have to think about who we are now as inhabitants of a globe that is quite fragile and nonetheless is quite beautiful, and it's ours to protect rather than to exploit. Once you begin to think that way, to treat our planet as a whole, then you can no longer just exploit it for particular purposes that are inconsistent with its own nature. In other words, you bring into context the whole nature of modern scientific theory, which began with Francis Bacon saying, we don't just observe nature, Aristotle did that. We put nature on an operating table and force her to give up her secrets. Well, we forced that, and now nature is talking back. And so you have to take all of a sudden into account what's the matter with the methodology that has underlaid all of our scientific and therefore our material progress in the last 400 years. That creates a huge problem which we haven't yet figured out either. How do you respect nature and yet also continue a scientific experiment that doesn't respect nature? So globalization or universal community isn't new to human experience. It didn't start with that picture taken during the Apollo 8 moon launching. So it started, at least for the Western imagination, with the Roman Empire's 1,000-year-old history. And that continues to haunt those interested in living beyond the confines of tribe or nation state. It was dependent economically, the Roman Empire, on animal power and human slavery, not racial slavery, but slavery based on conquest. The Roman Empire created a system of roads and of laws, of philosophical theory, and of military strategies that conquered and united the peoples of the Mediterranean basin and eventually parts of Northern Europe, Africa, and Western Asia. With the breakdown of that authority, the Church in the West and the Papal Office itself created a community with universalist claims based now on faith in one God who created and redeemed the entire universe and who also created intelligent human beings. Reason, Aristotle said, is open to everything. It takes us beyond ourselves, beyond our bodies, beyond our interests. In the scholastic translation of Aristotle's works, reason is quidammodo omnia. In some sense, reason is everything. We can think about anything at all, and rational principles that are universal are the backbone, therefore, of a moral law based on human nature as such, not on particular positive laws, and therefore transcendent to any particular community or political or economic order. The Church, looking for instruments for explicating a universal faith, reached not to pagan religions, which she condemned as false, but to pagan philosophy, equal in its rational principles to the scope of the faith itself. So the idea that religion somehow is based upon pagan myths is entirely contrary to the history of the rational examination of God's revelation in our own tradition. These principles were used much later in the age of Western colonization to endow with legal rights conquered peoples and races whose human dignity was an article of faith. They formed eventually the basis of international law, and the Spanish Dominicans did this more than anyone else. That's a large question which I won't go into here. But in fact, the Spanish emperor was told you have to treat the indigenous peoples of the New World as you would Spaniards. And then everything worked itself out in relationship then to a state order that said, obviously, you can't have people who are Spaniards if they weren't Catholic, but that wasn't only true for Spain, it was true for Sweden, it was true for every nation of the world. After the treaties of Westphalia in 1648, the religion of the people was the religion of the king. And so if you departed from that religion, if you were a heretic, you had to leave or be killed because you were a traitor to the state itself. That idea that somehow, in order to have a civil society united, you must have only one religion is, of course, something that came to an end with our own First Amendment to the Constitution. That was what was revolutionary, truly. Political independence was not revolutionary, but the idea that you could have a state where the people didn't all belong to the same church and it wasn't the church of the ruler, that was revolutionary. And that was our contribution to the development of human rights and of universal law. So the Church, looking about for its principles, found them in philosophies that weren't originally based upon divine revelation at all, but based upon human beings philosophizing about the human condition as such. In the Enlightenment period, then, universal human rights were codified as universal civil rights. And the civil rights of particular social contract societies were to be judged by this universal standard from nature itself. They were codified differently in the French and in the American revolutions, both of which had universalist pretensions, and reworked later in Marxist theory, which is universalist, and in the founding principles of the United Nations. It creates a problem when you start saying that there is something outside of positive law that it truly has legal binding authority, and yet it's very difficult to codify, but it's always there. It was there in the common law, certainly in the culture of the English peoples. That's disappeared now, and we're left mostly with statutory law and the particular jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, which can only depend upon precedent and not depend upon principles outside of the positive law. It created a problem in the Nuremberg trials, if you're old enough to remember them, because everything that the Nazis were accused of doing was legal. They all perfectly obeyed the positive laws of the Third Reich. So therefore there had to be something, and they invented crimes against humanity, which sounds very much like natural law, but they had to invent it in order to have those trials in such a way that legal theory was respected, and yet the particular positive laws, whether Germany or anywhere else, were not sufficient to explain crimes against humanity itself. What distinguishes contemporary globalization from the universalist perspectives of empire and world trade, of natural law and civil rights, is the introduction of human subjectivity, and this is the cultural dimension, which is presupposed, into an expanded horizon made possible by electronic devices at the service of social communications. Sports, World Cups, music, religion, identified as personal spirituality that is open to a transcendent presence, but defined by us rather than by God, are all manifestations of a new human language that creates a universal ambience at the beck and call of a human subject. And that's the complication of natural law theory. It doesn't depend upon essences, it depends upon subjects now. So we inhabit a new space. We listen differently, and we create narratives that have no standard outside of themselves. Contrast, for example, the way in which technology has progressed. We started with the use of a compass that directs us by telling us where nature establishes true north as a certain point of reference. Then we supplanted that with radar to find a target that is predetermined by us with a field that we determine according to our own interests. And that prefigures the streaming of music or images that serve the passing interest of a listening subject who creates out of them the world that he or she wants to inhabit for this moment. In this act of creation, this subjectivization of essences and of natural processes themselves, in which there can be no single narrative, the subject experiences a simultaneous expansion and compression of time and space. On the one hand, globalization has connected people and places around the world in a way not earlier known to humanity. On the other hand, those very connections have created a density of relationships that can become overwhelming and even oppressively isolating. The computer as a symbol represents interconnectedness within the whole world. A young person told me at one point, "I love my computer, all my friends are inside it." The computer as a symbol represents the expanded interconnectedness of the entire world in that ecological sense, that consciousness born of a global vision. But the computer chip, with its compression of information into a very tiny place, gives us also an image of an individual self-contained and self-directed. The twin forces of expansion and compression create a lively, energetic dynamic of life and also reveal contradictions within the phenomenon of contemporary globalization. To this phenomenon of globalization, a vast interconnectedness inhabited by subjects sometimes closed in on themselves, the Catholic Church brings a theology of ecclesial communion intended to be a sign of global solidarity. Ecclesial communion is a network of relationships among persons who share the gifts of Christ based upon natural gifts that the Creator gives us, gifts that have a universal intentionality because Christ is a universal Savior, encompassing therefore every human subject, if not actually, then in intention and potentially. In order to understand the way Catholic social teaching evaluates social and economic theory, it is good therefore to examine self-consciously the notion of gift, because in the end, everything is grace, everything is gift. Creation, redemption, everything is a gift. But a gift is a commodity, it's something, isn't it? But always with a person attached. Somebody gives you a gift, you know who it is. A gift is gratuitous, it's not a purchase or an exchange. If you're supposed to give something in return, then it's not a gift. But because there's always a person attached to the commodity, to refuse a gift, the commodity, is to reject the giver. If someone gives you socks, your grandmother, that she's not knitted for Christmas, and you say, "Grandma, I don't like your socks," you not only refuse the socks, you have broken the relationship with your grandmother. So the gifts of Christ to his people are both invisible, divine grace, theological virtues, etc. Then they're also visible. The structure of the church based upon apostolic authority, the visible sacraments of the apostolic churches, the gospel expressed in human languages. These are the basis for a vast network of ecclesial relationships, because when you accept a gift, you have a relationship with the giver. So accepting these gifts from Christ means you're related to everyone that he's related to, and the purpose of sharing the gifts is to unite all humanity with God and with each other in truth and love, the only gifts that finally the church can make use of. The purpose of the Second Vatican Council was precisely that. I won't rehearse all of that, but if you read the reason that Pope John the 23rd gave for calling the council, he said, humanity's going to destroy itself. The Cuban Missile Crisis was upon us. He thought for sure, many people did, this is the end. He said, why have we come to this, where we're divided constantly by classes, economic classes in the Russian Revolution. We're divided by nationalities, Catholics killing Catholics in the name of their nation states. We're divided now by ideologies that are bringing us to the brink of nuclear disaster. We're divided by racism. How did this happen? That the human race cannot see itself as a human family. And who can use the language of family, of telling people you're really brothers and sisters, no matter all your differences, but the Catholic Church? That's what he saw. That the Church has to be the agent, the only possible agent for uniting, for making globally visible what is in fact the truth of our relationships given before we work in these divisions. So what they came out of was this theology of the church as a communion, what I just described, a network of relationships based upon sharing gifts from Christ, which is to be the leaven for human solidarity, a network of relationships based upon normal human activities, but understood as the sharing of gifts primarily before any kind of contracts or citizenship or anything else comes into play. That's the presupposition of Catholic social teaching, as it is based upon Catholic doctrine regarding the nature of the church and the nature of the world itself. Nobody said that the world is going to become Catholic, although that is, of course, what we think would be the intention of God himself as believers. But nonetheless, what he said was, whether we're very small or very large, we can be 11. And we do that by dialogue, not by imposing. We just need freedom, that's all. We don't need any structural privileges. We just need to be free, and people need to be free to refuse or to accept any religion, including our own. But we have to be free, as does every religious body, in order to preach and to exercise the mission as they understand it that comes to them from God, however they understand that. So the methodology for this globalization was dialogue, and the goal was to be sure that the human race would not destroy itself. There's a big difference between an anthropology that starts with relationships and one that starts with individuals who then create relationships through social contracts. And that was very clear to me in 1998, I think it was, when I went with John Paul II to Mexico City for him to sign a document called Ecclesia in America, the Church in America. It was a document that came out of the Synod. Before the great Jubilee celebration of the year 2000, John Paul II wanted each of the continents to have their own synod, so people would think beyond the nation state and beyond their own culture. They think in continental terms, and then finally we would be able to see how the continents can come together. I was the secretary for that synod in 1998, and when the apostolic exhortation came out, he invited those of us who had been officers of the synod to go with him to Mexico City to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, right smack in the middle of the Western Hemisphere, in order to sign the document. It was very interesting because after that he went to St. Louis, and the contrast was simply this. When we got off the plane in the airport in Mexico City, there were 12 miles to the nunciature in the capital city that were lined by young people in their late teens, early 20s. The whole route was lined by those young people who were holding back the crowds. There were millions of people who had assembled to greet the Pope and to welcome him to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. But the young people then stayed with us. They walked with us into our hotel. They saw that we were situated in our hotel rooms. They asked us where we were from. They told us about themselves, their families, their plans. There were certainly police along the route, and there were certainly police in the hotels, but you didn't see them. What you saw instead was this network of relationships that they established with us who were coming. And it was a public event based upon the relationships that were there in faith and were now made visible in the public acceptance of the successor of Peter, who is the center of unity, visible unity in the church. It was genuinely moving experience, and would have been moving even if I hadn't gone from there to St. Louis. In St. Louis, where the Pope stopped before he went back to Rome, that was the only stop in this country. Again, it was a public event. But when we drove through the streets of St. Louis, there was not a person to be seen. The Secret Service had been commissioned to protect the Pope. And where we were protected by relationships in Mexico City, we were protected by isolation in St. Louis. The only way to be sure that the Pope was not harmed was to be sure he didn't come into contact with human beings. And they saw to that. The exception was in the stadium and in the cathedral, where the church controlled the ambience and the space. Then you could see where John Paul II came alive, as he did in his visit to Mexico. But there's a difference there, isn't there? It seems to me it was very clearly drawn. We protect by isolating people. We're very big on privacy. They protect by relationships. And the church is very clear that it's relationships that are primary. Not a condemnation of anything else, but it is a sense that finally who we are depends upon our relationships, and that's where we start. So when you start looking at Catholic social teaching, they're going to say always, how does this affect the first community, the family? If you want to know how the Catholic bishops will react to something, ask, how does this law, how does this proposal, how does this movement, or whatever it is, affect the human family? If it's bad for the family, it's bad for the human race, and it's going to be condemned by Catholic social teaching. That's where you start. And from there you go into the larger communities as well. But you always start and you end with relationships. So having said those presuppositional elements, as far as it goes, I'd like to then very quickly go through the three principles that complement, I think, what Cardinal Turkson said yesterday. They're just three principles that run through Catholic social teaching and are presupposed, again, but also made quite explicit, unlike the presuppositions I was talking about that come from global culture. The first principle is the principle of global common good. The second is the principle of gratuity and reciprocity. And the third is the principle of subsidiarity and solidarity. It's very difficult to define the global common good. Cardinal Turkson did as good a job as I've ever heard anybody do it last night. But this is part of the problem with Catholic social teaching. It doesn't seem concrete, especially in economics. It doesn't get very technical, at least not in the papal magisterium, and it gets dangerously technical when individual bishops try to apply it and they don't know what they're talking about at times. So you're left with terms that are evocative, but at times difficult to define. The definition has to come through conversations such as this, and your own thinking and your own scholarship based on your own research and experience. In general, we can say that the global common good, the common good of everybody on the planet, is a stable system, and that's part of the problem, a stable system of economic and political relationships in which the basic needs of everyone are at least minimally satisfied because of a mutually shared deep conviction of the personal dignity of each subject. The personal dignity of each subject. When I was a young bishop, I was first assigned to a diocese in Washington State, in the northwestern part of this country, which is the most unchurched part of the country. It was never churched. Washington State is a desert, a northern desert, in the middle part of the state, which is the Diocese of Yakima. But when you irrigate that desert, you get these marvelous orchards and beautiful fruit, and especially golden apples and red delicious apples, and now wine grapes and hops and all the rest. Who harvests all that fruit? Mexican farm workers. Some of them legal, some of them not. But there was a kind of acceptance that we needed the labor, and so you didn't ask too many questions. When I got there, a group of them came to me and said, Bishop, we want to form a union. They were ununionized. And I said, oh, why do you want to form a union? I kind of knew why, at least I thought I knew why. That is, the living conditions were very bad. They were living in shacks that were put up for summer workers, and they were living in them all year round. And it's a desert, but it's a northern desert. So in the winter, at night, it's 25 or 30 degrees below zero. And then it gets up to 45 or 50. And during the summer, it's 105, during the day, and then 45 at night. It's a desert. So you have these extreme contrasts in climate when the sun is up and when the sun is down. So I thought, well, you got bad housing. Secondly, you have very bad wages when you're trying to create a family and take care of them. You have a lot of things to complain about, but tell me what you're most interested in. What he said was, the leader of the men, Bishop, they don't respect us. That was the first concern. They don't respect us. Now, these are terribly materially difficult conditions, but what they're most concerned was human respect. This is, people not very well educated, but formed in a deep sense, largely through their faith, that they are the possessors of a right before people because they've received the gift of human life from God himself. And with that, I went to the growers and said, they don't think you respect them. And they were really upset by that. They knew that the conditions, economic conditions, had to be better, and they did make some effort to do that, I have to say. But the idea that they were not respectful of them had not occurred to them. It wasn't part of their economic theory. It wasn't part of the way they were looking at things. Some of them were Catholic, some not. But that sense of the conviction that we all are to be respected because we're all a gift from God, and we all have the gift of life itself and of new life in Christ, in their case, that is fundamental to this sense of the global common good. You cannot have a common good unless every individual is deeply respected and knows that he or she is respected precisely as a human being. This depends, therefore, upon recognizing that we have a right relationship to God. It's why worship is the first of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. If you don't have a relationship to God right, you're going to get all the relationships to neighbor wrong. And so that starts the question of the global common good. What are the right relationships based upon human dignity that have to be realized if, in fact, we're going to have a just society as well as an economically productive society? The second principle, besides the principle of the common good with both material concerns and immaterial concerns, is that of gratuity and reciprocity. it goes back to the question of gift. It's not that gratuity and reciprocity didn't show up in previous ages in Catholic social teaching, even in that of the scholastics. You had discussions of commutative justice, which is the just exchange of goods or services according to contracts that are agreed upon, commutative. And you have distributive justice, that is the principle that aims at a certain fairness in society, a certain basic response to many of those needs that we've talked about in an equal fashion, particularly for the poor. But the principle is now used more thematically as gratuity and reciprocity, which brings us back to that idea of gift. Reciprocity is similar to exchange or commutative justice, in that when I help you out, you feel an obligation to help me in return. But at the same time, it's similar to the pure gift relationship in that you don't have to help me. You don't have to return the favor. There's no obligation to do so. It's not gratuitous. Not in law and not anything except on the basis of human trust and a desire to create a human community. You may reciprocate even by helping someone else. Daniel Finn, who's been part of these conversations at times and is at St. John's University in Collegeville, talks about the example of holding the door open for a stranger whose arms are full or contributing to a good friend's favorite charitable cause. Such an action may simply be the right thing to do when we experience an informal social obligation as well once that we ourselves have benefited from such actions by others. We recognize because we've received these gifts that we have to in some sense reciprocate. That's reciprocity. But it isn't an obligation in the strict legal sense at all. Something similar occurs in economic life when an employee or an employer does something for the other not required by contract, and the other feels some obligation to reciprocate. And that's what makes corporations civil and human, as opposed to just simply machines. You have to be careful because of quid pro quo. A necessity is no longer a gift if, in fact, it's even the source of corruption. It's based upon exchanges that are not legal and can't be put into a contract, but we expect a return through a wink and a nod, through a handshake, whatever it is. But that kind of reciprocity, apart from corruption in the good sense, is part of the software that allows families, businesses, and society as a whole to boot up each morning, to have the trust necessary to walk outside the door, that you're not going to be killed, that there is a reciprocal respect that will enable us to continue our lives with some sense of security and freedom. This isn't often discussed, I don't believe, in economic analyses, because it's described to sociologists as their field of study. But it means that we should look at economic corporations and other forms of association in a more generous way. In the papal magisterium of Benedict XVI, he begins to talk about hybrid forms of commercial behavior. And there are examples. I won't go into them because I don't understand them very well. I'm not a disciple of the Bologna School, and somebody else that knows something about it might be able to speak to it. But nonetheless, what he's saying is that the generosity that is part of reciprocity and gratuitousness, the generosity that is part of being human, demands that something be above the bottom line rather than below the bottom line, which is philanthropy, when you start talking about giving gifts to others, even within the purview of your budgets. We've talked about the first principle, the global common good, and the second principle, gratuity and reciprocity. The third is subsidiarity and solidarity. And these two can be variously understood because they depend upon a certain pluralism of actors. Here, Russell Hittinger, I think, has given the best explanation I've ever seen of this principle of subsidiarity and solidarity. It presupposes that there are actors at different levels and that they interact. They depend upon one another. According to the logic of subsidiarity, the higher authority offers its help, its subsidium, only when an individual, social, or financial actors are intrinsically deficient in capacity or cannot manage by themselves to do what is required. So it's not necessarily a question of scale, the big actors and the small actors, no. It's a question of the ability to act. Can this group or this person do what he or she has to do in order to contribute to the common good and to live with dignity? If she can't, there must be a help, a subsidium, an aid by someone in a different part of the globe, in a different part of the economy, to help this person become a genuine actor in control of their own life and contributing to the global common good and the economic welfare of others. Thanks to the principle, however, of solidarity, a lasting and a fruitful relationship should build up between global civil society and a world public authority, as states, intermediate bodies, various institutions, including financial ones, and citizens make their decisions about what they're going to do from this comprehensive view. It's a view, therefore, of the global common good which transcends national goods. So the principle of subsidiarity and solidarity is not just a question of what is big and what is small, but rather of agency and a pluralism of actors in a just society. The synthesis of this in the teaching of Benedict XVI is charity, as we know. Usually in social theory, or now in economics, there's been a division between charity and justice. Reinhold Niebuhr's elaborated social theory of Christian realism said that in private and familial and personal interaction, charity is first. But in larger interactions, in the case of warfare or business, justice is the norm. Benedict XVI, in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, said, no, you can't be just to someone if you don't love them in some fashion, and you can't love someone if you're going to be unjust to them. So that's the liaison, that's bringing together the communal and relational elements in what could be abstract virtues taken in their various distinctions. The next distinction, between charity and justice, which has become so much a part of our civic life, and even to some extent in Catholic social thought in the 60s and 70s, is now overcome, in a sense, in the magisterium of Benedict XVI. If we don't overcome that distinction, religion becomes a club, and the public space is then dominated by public institutions, largely by government, and that simply falls apart when you're talking about universal community, a global society. Charity and justice move hand in hand, and it's charity that's most basic. Charity, the Pope said, is at the heart of the Church's social doctrine. Every responsibility and every commitment spelled out by that doctrine is derived from charity, which, according to the teaching of Jesus, is the synthesis of the entire law. It gives real substance to the personal relationship with God and with neighbor. It is the principle not only of micro-relationships with friends, with family members, or within small groups, but also of macro-relationships, social, economic, and political one. So the synthesis of Catholic social teaching, of all the principles we've talked about and of the vision that underlies it, explains the importance of family, as I said, the importance of community, the beginning with relationships that is the foundation for our social theory. The third point, and I'll end this quickly, is simply what about the challenge then of a global regulatory authority? Because in a sense, it seems to me rather abstract to move from the principle that, well, if things are going wrong, somebody has to try to regulate it in such a way that charity will be respected, that the respect for individual people will be assured, that relationships will be guarded, and so you kind of bring in the political dimension to say, well, there must be a regulatory authority of some sort. The Pope has said very clearly when talking to the United Nations that the ultimate authority cannot be a nation state. It's too small. And furthermore, talking to the United Nations when he came to this country, he said, your job is to protect citizens from their own governments at times. You have the necessity to have a humanitarian intervention. So he's obviously trying to relativize the modern nation states that have already been relativized by economic activity and by global culture. And he's trying to do that in a more systematic, structured way. The problem is that, first of all, it's hard to figure out what that would be, as happened last night as we began to talk about it, and how, secondly, it could be without inviting more corruption. Is it naive to imagine that when we find so much of our political life in this or any other country fraught with corruption, that if you build a larger regulatory authority, it too isn't going to be fraught with corruption? At least from my Chicago cynicism, I would at least raise the question. It's not that I'm contesting Catholic social teaching, and certainly not the magisterium of the Pope. You know, if you've got goods that are more than national, and you've got exchanges that are truly international, even global, then how are you going to regulate them if in fact they're not self-regulatory, and they're not? Answerable only to themselves, economic institutions will be as corrupt as any other. But how are you going to regulate them when there is no universal political authority, and the UN is obviously not the answer, but nonetheless the popes are very respectful of the UN because it is, inchoatively at least, some kind of universal system that permits the universal pastor to talk to the whole world. So the UN isn't the answer exactly, and yet it might be the beginning of an answer, even though many of its own positions are against Catholic social teaching. Nonetheless, it too is subject to power politics, as we all know, and is certainly not free of corruption. So how is it that if we create something else, it too will be free of corruption? I don't know. I think that is a weak point in developing what is, however, theoretically a necessity. There are goods that are beyond the scope of any political authority right now. There's supranational, the oversight of the global economy, full disarmament, food security and peace, the safeguarding of the environment of the globe, the regulation of migration as people have the right to move across national boundaries that are artificial anyway, especially in Africa. Single states are no longer able to exercise their sovereignty over all these fields, and therefore the new situation requires integrating responsibilities and decision-making transnationally. The European Union was a stab at that, but of course it comes into the contradiction of having a unified monetary policy with a diversified fiscal policy, and that's the crisis as I see it going on now. So that's not exactly the answer, although it was a model trying to build on Catholic social economy as opposed to a market economy. But nonetheless, we don't have good examples right now. We have a goal, however, because if we can't come up with some kind of transnational regulatory principle, we have it already sometimes in international law and treaties, etc. But if we can't come across something more comprehensive than that, then the global economy is going to be a source of oppression, not of freedom, and certainly not something that is compatible with Catholic social teaching. The challenge is to create a global authority from the bottom up, a public and accountable global authority, which is not a super state. But without it, the world's economy and our politics could be manipulated by powerful nations and by economic interests as they are now. Last words, therefore, I would like to say is that there is a spirituality of economic life in Catholic social teaching. It was brought up by Pope Paul VI at the end of the Second Vatican Council when he talked about the changed relationship between church and world. He said the spirituality that must inform us in economics and political affairs in the church itself is that of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, in the parable according to St. Luke's Gospel, is someone who binds up the wounds of the world. And he said the church must be part of that exercise of being a Good Samaritan. Other agencies are too. But we have a kind of a global picture that enables us to talk about the wounds of the entire world. The church in all her pluralism, but nonetheless with a basic unity based upon faith, binds up the wounds of the world that, left to itself, will fritter away its resources in divisive ways and even very dangerous ways. In other words, the spirituality that he was talking about is that of a subject acting within an objective universal order that serves a common good and a common goal, namely the creation of a civilization of love. That's Catholic social teaching and its global pretensions. Thank you very much.